Everyone is talking about Arsenal this season because they are very different to how they were last season. But the question on everybody's lips is, does that mean they're worse this season? Now, the simplest way to start answering that kind of question is to have a look at the underlying numbers. So on the board in front of me here, I've got a rolling 10-game average of the non-penalty expected goals for. That's the blue line, that's good, you want that to be higher. And non-penalty expected goals against, that's the red line, you want that to be below the blue line. So this isn't a good period, but you can see in the last couple of seasons, Arsenal have been really good because the blue line is much higher than the red line. Now, if we fast forward to this season, a very different picture emerges because what we can see is we've got a bit of a flat line in terms of the expected goals for. Now, this is much lower than it has been for the last couple of seasons when Arsenal have been really good, which suggests that Arsenal's attacking play is a little bit down from where you might expect it to be. But on the other hand, if we look at the red line, something very good is happening, and that is that red line is dropping like a stone. That means that Arsenal are getting much harder to generate chances against, and that is a good thing. So the answer on the face of it isn't necessarily that Arsenal are worse, but certainly that Arsenal are very different. So let's just have a dig into the details to see why things are so different for Arsenal this season. Now, this is the starting 11 that we've seen from Arsenal across the last few games, and what I want to do in this video is talk about the differences between this season and last season on the basis of 3 players. So we've got Declan Rice, we've got Martin Odegaard, and we've got Kai Havertz over here on the bench. So let's start out with Declan Rice and the problem of Arsenal's build-up. Now, why am I talking about build-up when the question at hand is why are Arsenal worse at attacking this season? Well, for all good teams, what they're trying to do when they're building up play is getting the ball into this area of the pitch. Obviously, this is the most dangerous area to be in if you're trying to score goals, and your build-up is going to impact the way that you are going to generate chances in this area. If your build-up is coming from wide areas versus central areas, it's going to change things. If your build-up is faster or slower, that's also going to have an impact on how you generate chances as well. Now, last season, Arsenal's build-up unit was very different. We didn't have Jorginho starting in many games. Actually, Thomas Partey tended to be the pivot player in that build-up unit. And then obviously Declan Rice was signed in the summer, so last season Granit Xhaka was playing in the left 8 slot. And so when it came to building up, Arsenal tended to have the same players in the same sorts of positions in most of the games, and that sort of consistency is really important when it comes to build-up. Now, Arsenal tend to use a double pivot in their build-up phases, and as you can see, there's only one midfielder now in that sort of pivot space. So there's a couple of ways that Arsenal can end up with 2 players in that area, and those are going to be the 2 players around which the build-up pivots around. So on the one hand, you can have someone like Granit Xhaka dropping in alongside Thomas Partey, but also what we've seen from Arsenal is an inverting fullback as well. So Zinchenko can move inside along Partey, and you've got these 2 players now in a double pivot in the middle of the field. Now, why might Arsenal want a double pivot in their build-up structure? Well, let's just have a think about Arsenal playing against a team who are going to line up in a 4-4-2 out of possession. Now, when Arsenal have the ball at the back and they're trying to build out, this unit of 6 players on the opposition are going to try and make it hard for them to actually stabilise their build-up. And as you can see, there's 4 players in the opposition's first line of build-up that match up against the 4 players in Arsenal's back line. So the idea then is that if the ball comes here, this player can step up. If the ball comes here, this player can step up, etc., etc. And by having a really wide structure, what they're doing is actually stopping Arsenal from having comfortable possession of the ball. Now, if you move another player inside the opposition block, so this unit here, what this is going to do is it's going to pin the opposition because there's now more players in the middle. So these 2 players are probably going to come a little bit narrower to make it harder for those passes to be played through the middle. And these central midfielders are going to come inside too in order to stop there being space around that double pivot. So what you're doing is you're pinning the opposition players around you. And again, by squeezing the center of the pitch, you're opening up space elsewhere. So you can see there's actually passes through the lines here. So you can maybe have Jesus dropping in, ball coming through here. So the opposition probably don't want those sorts of easy passes in between the lines. So you may see the wide players now pulling inside to block those off. What this means is that the opposition is stopping Arsenal from building up through the middle of the field, and they're allowing them space in the wide areas in order to build up. Now, why might that be the case? Well, because if you're able to progress the ball in the wide areas, you're going to end up with the ball around the corner spot, and you still then have to get the ball inside. Whereas if you progress the ball through the middle and beat the opposition lines of pressure, you now have a much more direct route to goal, and you're going to generate much more dangerous chances. It's also worth saying that this is why a lot of teams like to invert their fullback, because let's imagine again that we've got a flat back 4 from Arsenal, and Zinchenko is being tracked by the wide player for the opposition. If Zinchenko comes inside, that's probably going to pull this player narrower as well. And what this does is it opens out a line of access between Gabriel, the left-sided centre-back, and Martinelli, the wide forward. This is a nice pass to make into his feet if he drops in. But again, what the opposition are doing here is allowing that build-up to happen in the wide areas. Now, this season, things look very different in terms of Arsenal's build-up, because as we know, Declan Rice was brought in the summer. nominally to play in this pivot role here. And we've also got Kai Havertz, who's been playing as a left-sided 8, although there have been other players who fitted in there as well. But on top of this, Arsenal have played lots of different players in lots of different positions. So Zinchenko started the season out injured. He was replaced by Jurrien Timber, who was brought in the summer, but then Jurrien Timber gets injured, so he's off. Zinchenko eventually comes back. And then on the other side, when Zinchenko wasn't available, we actually saw the inverting player playing from the right-hand side, so Ben White was dropped, and then we saw someone like Thomas Partey playing in here, and he could invert from the other side. But as we said, consistency is really important for your build-up structure, and what we've seen in the first few weeks of the season from Arsenal is lots of different players in lots of different positions and lots of different structures in order to get that second player into the double pivot area. But it's important to remember that having a double pivot isn't just about pinning the opposition, so pulling them close towards you in order to create space in the wide areas. Elite teams also want to be able to actually build up through these sorts of spaces in order, as we said, to move the ball into central areas because it's much more dangerous to attack through that area. And this is where another problem has arisen for Arsenal, because in order to be able to build up in this way, you need to have players who are really good at receiving the ball in tight spaces and being able to play balls through lines of pressure in order to have that central progression. And so far this season, Declan Rice hasn't shown that he has the ability to receive the ball in these tight spaces with his back to goal, turn out of pressure and actually move the ball in these central progressions. And so what we often see him doing is actually moving outside of the block and receiving facing down the field, because that's how he likes to receive it. But all that happens when you do this is you've now moved one of your pivot players outside of the block. Now, building up in this way does make it easier for Arsenal to move the ball in those wider areas, but it does make it harder for them to build up through the centre of the pitch. And Mikel Arteta obviously wants them to have central penetration. So what we've seen more recently is a slight switch up where Havertz actually hasn't played as a left 8. Rice has been pushed up there, and then we see Jorginho coming into the double pivot space alongside Zinchenko when he's inverting. Now, this has eased the problem somewhat, but Arsenal are still overwhelmingly likely to move the ball down the field in the wide areas rather than through the centre of the field. I think this is an explanation for why it is that their attacking numbers are a little bit low this season. And this shows up really nicely in the data, because what we've got here now is Arsenal's final third entries divided across 5 channels of the pitch. And as we can see across the last few seasons, Arsenal have been really good at getting the ball into the box through the central spaces. But if we fast forward to this season, we can see that those final third entries in the central spaces have dropped right down. So only 11% of central progression. And as we can see in the other seasons, it's always been around 15 or 14. And then even in the half spaces, we can see those numbers are down as well. And as you can see, a lot more reliance on this right-hand channel, but that is where Bukayo Saka is, one of Arsenal's most dangerous players. So that makes a degree of sense. But the concerning thing here is much less central progression from Arsenal into the final third. So this would explain why Arsenal's attacking numbers are slightly down this season, but it's important to remember that it's not just about the channel that you're entering the final third that is important. We've also talked about the speed of Arsenal's build-up, which can have an impact as well. Now, I just wanted to show a couple of screenshots from Arsenal's game against Chelsea just to talk a little bit about tempo in build-up. So what we've got here is Arsenal in possession of the ball. They're moving this way down the field, and what we have is Chelsea in that block of 4 and then 2 that we saw on the board before. And what we've got here is actually Arsenal overloading this area. So we've got Arsenal's 2 centre-backs, so Saliba and Gabriel here. We've got Zinchenko and Jorginho, who are playing as pivots. And then we've got Jesus, who's dropped right in to help out. Here's Declan Rice dropping into the fullback space because Zinchenko's inside. And we've even got Martin Odegaard right the way across the pitch to come and help out. Now, what this means is that there's 7 Arsenal players in this area and 6 Chelsea players. So Arsenal have managed to get an overload, 7v6, which should help them to be able to move the ball down the field. But what it also means is that there's now going to be an overload somewhere else in Chelsea's favour. Now, Chelsea have a back 4 somewhere across here, and Arsenal have 3 other players who aren't on this screenshot. Now, Ben White is somewhere over here because he's the right back, but that means that there's only 2 Arsenal players then who are up against the back 4 of Chelsea. That is Martinelli on one side and Saka on the other. Now, what this means is that if Arsenal are able to move the ball through these lines of Chelsea pressure, once they get through there, the only players they have to progress the ball to are going to be Martinelli and Saka in a 2v4. So that overload here to help them build up is actually going to be a disadvantage once they get through the build-up phase. Now, there's 2 options that Arsenal have here. Either they can rely on Martinelli and Saka being elite attackers and just have them in that 4v2 overload and hope they can produce something, or if Martinelli and Saka receive the ball after Arsenal have built up through these lines of pressure, they're going to have to slow the play down in order to let their teammates catch up, and that is going to slow their attacking down. Now, it's also worth adding that if your build-up isn't very good, then you're not going to be able to get through the lines of pressure anyway, and that's also going to slow you down as well. So if I fast forward this clip 25 seconds, we see that Arsenal have actually failed to build up through Chelsea's pressure. The ball has ended up back at David Raya, and he's just going to kick it long, and actually it's going to end up with a turnover. And so the result of all this is not only are Arsenal building up in wider areas rather than central areas, their attacks are much less direct. And this shows up really nicely in the data, because if we see through the whole of the Arteta period, we can see that Arsenal are putting up around 2 direct attacks per 90 minutes. And if we fast forward to this season, we can see that this drops right off a cliff. So those direct attacks are now dropping down much closer to 1 per 90 minutes. Now, why might the speed of Arsenal's attacks matter? Well, Arsenal actually have a set of players who actually benefited from playing in these more direct attacking moments. If you take that away, it's going to have an impact on them. And that brings us to our second player, Martin Ødegaard. Now, if we look at Martin Ødegaard's stats, comparing last season to this season, we can see that there has been some kind of knock-on impact. Expected goals is about the same, but we can see his expected assists have dropped by about half. He's taken fewer shots from inside the box, and he's taken more shots from outside of the box than he did last season. And then on top of that, if we look at his passes played into the box, we can see that he was up at around 6.67 last season. That has now dropped down to 5.81 this season. And there's a lot of people in the Arsenal fan base asking why it is that Martin Ødegaard is not the player that he was last season. And I would argue that it's actually because he is a player who suits playing more dynamically. When Arsenal are able to play the ball through the opposition quickly, and Ødegaard is able to receive the ball between the lines and then turn and run towards opposition defences, that's when he's really at his best. And this season that isn't happening at all, because Arsenal are tending to progress the ball in the wide areas. That just gives a chance for the opponents to drop into a lower block in the middle of the pitch, and then Arsenal are trying to work this low block around the edge of the box, and this just isn't a situation that suits Martin Ødegaard. But there's also another factor that's having an impact here, and so we need to talk about game state effect. Now, what do I mean by game state? Well, game state is simply anything that affects the state of a game, and red cards are a really good example of this. So if an opponent goes down to 10 men, it's going to change the way that you play against them. Now, goals also have an impact on the state of a game as well. So if you go a goal up, it's going to change the way that you're playing. You're not in need of a goal, so you're not going to push down the field so much perhaps, and you're going to be able to just sit deeper and wait for the opponent to come out, create more space in their structure, and that should make it easy for you to go out and score another. Now, last season, Arsenal were the beneficiary from these sorts of game state effects, because they were able to score early on in games, and that made it much easier for them to control those games. And also, as we've said, because opponents then had to score, they would push down the field more, it would leave more space open for Arsenal to attack, and that meant they could have more direct attacks. But this season, a very different picture has emerged. So what I've done is I've divided the game into 15-minute segments, and I've showed where Arsenal goals scored are coming from in each of those 15-minute segments. The white bars here are from last season, and the red bars are from this season. Now, there's a couple of things to notice. The first one is that Arsenal are scoring a lot of goals this season after the 76th minute, which goes to show just how many times they've dug themselves out in games this season. Now, there is a caveat to that, and that is that this season, the officials do seem to be adding a lot more extra time. So 76 to 90 minutes also includes extra time, so there's probably a longer time span here. So do take that with a pinch of salt, but that does match actually what's happened in a lot of Arsenal games that they've scored goals late on. But more importantly for us here, in terms of game state effect, we can see that Arsenal really haven't been scoring any goals early on in games. So 0 to 15 minutes, they have not scored a single goal this season. Now, if we move to the next section, we can see they are slightly up on last season, but if we actually add these two together, and I've got the percentages worked out here, we can see that Arsenal scored around 33% of their goals in the first 30 minutes last season, whereas this season they're only scoring around 22% of their goals in the first 30 minutes. And this means that Arsenal are spending much more time in a drawing game state than they were last season. So what I've got here on the board is just the data of the game states that teams are in per minute. So we can see the red bar here is the amount of time spent in a losing game state, the white bar is how much time they've spent in a drawing game state, and the yellow bar is how long they've spent in a winning game state. So if we look at Arsenal here, we can see that they spent around 16% of their games last season in a losing game state, 40% in a drawing game state, and then 44% in a winning game state. And as we said, when Arsenal are in a winning game state, it's going to be much more favourable conditions for them to have those dynamic attacks that they're much more dangerous in. Now, if we look at the data from this season, we can see that Arsenal are still spending around 16% of their games in a losing game state, but that drawing game state figure has now jumped from 40% up to 53%, and that means that rather than having 40% of their games where they're in a winning game state, it's now down to around 30%. Now, that's a swing of around 10%, which means that Arsenal are spending much less time in a winning game state, and that's going to have a knock-on impact in terms of their attacking speed. It's going to be harder for them to get those dynamic attacks, which they're so dangerous from. So when it comes to attacking play, Arsenal are much worse at progressing the ball through the centre of the field, but they're also much worse at generating those more dynamic attacks counterattacks that they were so dangerous from last season, and add all those things together, and it makes a lot of sense then that their attacking numbers this season are much lower than we've seen over the last season and a half. But as everybody knows, a team isn't only as good as their attacking numbers, you have to take into account their defensive numbers as well. And as we've said, Arsenal's defensive numbers look much better this season. As you can see, their expected goals against has plummeted like a stone this season. So the big question is, what's happened there? And this brings us to our final player, and that is Kai Havertz, a player who many people have asked, what does he actually do? But of course, most people are focusing on what he does in possession rather than what he does out of possession. And there is an argument to be made that Mikel Arteta's sole objective in the summer transfer market was to make Arsenal more difficult to beat. Now, we've already talked about Declan Rice's problems in possession, but it's undeniable that he's one of the best players out of possession in this position in the world. And so what Arsenal have ended up with after the summer transfer window is a team of players who are really strong out of possession of the ball. Because what Havertz gives you is a huge amount of flexibility out of possession. If Jesus isn't available, you can play him in the front line of this pressing system, or if you want to play Rice as the pivot player rather than Jorginho, you can play him as the 8, have Jesus in the front line, and then you can have him as a midfielder as well. So this is now a really, really solid out of possession system. Last season, Arsenal were really strong out of possession anyway, and this season they have the flexibility and the player profiles to just be one of the best out of possession teams in the world. And this strong out of possession setup gives Arsenal a couple of upsides. We've already seen that it's made them much more defensively strong. Their expected goals against is dropping right down, but it also gives them added attacking potential as well. So on the board in front of me here, I've just got a graphic which shows Arsenal's high regains last season and high regains this season as well. Now, obviously, more games were played last season than this season, so the important thing to look at here is the bottom line. So last season, Arsenal were getting around 5.7 high regains per game. That means they're winning the ball in the final third. And this season, we can see they're up on that. They're around 6.1 per game. Now, winning high regains is only important if you can generate shots and goals, and per both metrics we can see that Arsenal have improved this season. So they're up from one shot ending high turnover per game last season to 1.2 this season, and goal ending sequences are up from 0.2 per game last season up to 0.3 per game this season. So this is a very dangerous attacking tool for them as well. So are Arsenal worse this season? Well, they're definitely different this season, because if we go back to our rolling XG chart, you can see that the gap between expected goals for and against is currently about the same distance that it's been across the last few seasons for Arsenal. We can see that on the chart, everything has just shifted down a little bit, and that's because Arsenal brought in a different personnel of players, and that's made them defensively stronger. And so the question is, does that make Arsenal better or worse? Now, I don't have any data to back this up, but it's my hunch that if you're a team that's better at attacking, over the course of a longer sample size, you're going to come out on top more often. And that's because the more goals that you score, the more likely you are to win games. On the other hand, if you're a team that's better at defending, you're much harder to beat, and this changes the dynamic in knockout competitions, because in a knockout competition, once you've got through the group stages, all you ever have to do is draw games and then win on penalties. So the proof in the pudding for Arsenal this season is going to be how they perform in the league versus how they perform in the Champions League and the domestic cups. But it is worth saying in conclusion that Arsenal will still be concerned about their lack of attacking threat, and the goal going forwards will be to get these expected goals numbers up whilst keeping their expected goals against down. And if they can do that, then they'll be able to compete at the highest level, both in terms of leagues, but also knockout competitions.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.